Anyone who's witnessed the new Chinese lockdown must be terrified. The wailing from the towers, the cats locked up in bags. But could such a thing ever happen here? And are there any signs that we're heading in that direction? Hello there, you 5.5 million awakening wonders on a voyage together to new truth, to new systems, to new ways of understanding. Thank you for joining us on this voyage. Now, this is, in a sense, a terrifying video. I know loads of you will have already seen those wailing towers and those cats zipped up in bags. And this is a horrifying glimpse of what true state authoritarianism looks like. We're going to have a look at that video in a moment. If you've not seen me live, you can see me live. If you're not a subscriber, please subscribe now. It's vital that you subscribe. And if you're not a subscriber to my mailing list, please click on the link at the end to join my community. This story is terrifying. When I saw those images of those tower blocks and the wailing and the crying, and also as a cat lover, I've got like 11 cats, seeing those cats zipped up in a bag, I thought, well, maybe that's a temporary solution. No, I thought, bloody hell, what's going on in the world? When we talk about the Chinese state and the power of the Chinese state, wherever you stand politically, I guess you somewhat see it as a cautionary tale, a warning, an othered space, to use Edward Said's term, the Oriental, this kind of mystical other that can be poised as a comparison to the way things are done occidentally here in the West. It was a horrifying snapshot of what state power can look like in extreme. Let's have a look at it for a moment.
这个是正常人的叫啊，好了，终于2分钟，所有人都在叫。5分钟前头，俺们叫的没几个了，现在突然之间，所有人都叫了，要死！再这样弄下去，我跟侬讲，真的要出事体了，操，麻烦了。
Now, when I saw this video, I was terrified. Let me tell you something. I generally feel optimistic about human beings, about civilization, about society, about our collective ability to change the world. I know we've got the resources within ourselves. I believe in us because I believe in you. But when I saw that, I thought, oh my God, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we're literally doomed. When you see people trapped in their houses, wailing out in horror while their pets are being mercilessly executed on the streets, it's difficult to think that there's hope for humanity. As long as we see China as a cautionary tale rather than a model that ought be replicated with increasing authoritarianism here in the West, then I still see that there's a way out of this for us. Before we delve any deeper into the challenges we're facing right now in the West with social media control, with the co-opting of science, the utilization of the scientific model to enhance state authoritarianism, let's look at exactly what's going on right now in Shanghai so as we can see if it's a reasonable comparison and what we can learn from what's happening there. One of the hardest things to bear about the Shanghai lockdown, says a contact who has been shut in her small apartment with her father for the past 2 weeks, is the uncertainty. She spends her days on WeChat message groups trying to coordinate bulk food orders or looking out the window to see where the authorities have placed the red lines of their cordon sanitaire, which residents must not cross. There is little other information. Social media shows a city on the edge. Residents yell from their balconies and demand food. Drones broadcast messages demanding they return inside. Thousands of people who have tested positive are crammed into isolation centres. That sounds like the saturation of authoritarianism, albeit one person's experience of it. The idea of cordon sanitaire, isolation centres. This is what it looks like when totalitarianism, total authority. The key point here is, without democracy, a central authoritarian force decides how serious it is and then implements measures on that basis. In a democracy, all of the varying scientific and then popular opinions can be discussed and measures can be enacted that is a reflection of that. It's been an interesting journey, the coronavirus pandemic, hasn't it? There was a point where all of us were terrified. All of us were willing to do whatever it took. Why? Because of the sanctity of human life? Because life is sacred, because we should be taking care of one another and protecting one another. If over time those opinions evolve, not necessarily the belief that human life is sacred, but the degree of threat that this pandemic poses, then necessarily the measures would have to reflect those changing opinions and that changing reality. Because, of course, the authority that undergirded the lockdowns in our countries, and I mean all of us, there's no one I would exclude from our, is the truth, was undergirded by science. This is what we have to do. It's scientific. But whose science? What science? Because what I understand when someone says it's undergirded by science is this is objectively true. You cannot argue with this. There's no counter science. We don't need to censor other people's voices. We don't need to censor contrary arguments because this is just true. The sun's up there. It's burning hydrogen. It's turning into helium. It's lighting up the planet. It happened 13.8 billion years ago. Science, science, science. Incontrovertible facts. But is that the kind of science we're discussing here? This is by Fiona Fox, Chief Executive of the Science Media Centre, writing in The Guardian. That's where to direct your lawyers. 20 years ago, researchers were notably absent from the nation's airwaves. Today, researchers recognise it's not enough just to do great science. They must also communicate its implications. As a result, the UK now gets most of its science news directly from the best researchers, translated by outstanding science correspondents. However, this rule has a key exception, which occurs when government press teams get involved, and they are now exerting increasing control over UK science communication. So now there's an intervention. We're not just talking about science. The government is intervening inside. That's what it's saying here in The Guardian. Research may be done in universities and far-off research institutes, but reports about this work are often taken up by civil servants because these projects are carried out at the government's behest or are funded indirectly by it. Examples range from research on TB and badgers to studies on COVID-19's prevalence. There's a lot of controversy about badgers and tuberculosis. You bloody badgers! I don't even think there's such a thing as badgers. I think the government invented badgers. Oh, also COVID-19. Yeah, I've heard of that. During the pandemic, major COVID studies carried out at universities were commissioned by government departments and involved scientists working collaboratively to the public's undoubted benefit. However, that independently gathered scientific data also got swept up into a communication system designed for publicising the government's ideas and essentially political activity. I was approached several times by government comms experts frustrated by the mixed messages emanating from senior scientists who spoke openly about uncertainties and gaps in our knowledge on everything from mask wearing to the risks of school kids driving transmission. How could they curtail this? So Fiona Fox, Chief Executive of the Science Media Centre, is saying that conversation, debate, discussion and analysis was being curtailed during the pandemic. Now, what was being used to underwrite all of the measures taken during the pandemic? The lockdowns, the distancing, the masks. I'm not saying that those things weren't necessary, but Fiona Fox is saying that debate was being censored, certain information was being highlighted and amplified during the pandemic. Forget for a moment that the government, I don't know what they thought about it, but they were having parties. They were having parties, that's a fact. So, I don't know if they were terrified or not, but parties they were indeed having. Meanwhile, debate was being controlled. Now remember, the conversation we're having here is that we're not currently living in that horrifying dystopic vision that we just saw of people wailing and crying in Chinese towers, but we are living in a state where the government is using the authority gleaned from science to establish regulatory principles. So we're sort of on a gradient. They were asking the wrong person. Good work, Fiona Fox. Stand up for true science. I argued that messaging is for politicians and that glossing over uncertainty and conflicting views would risk undermining public trust in science at a critical time. That is what happened, isn't it? So remember, if people are unvaccinated or if people listen to wacky conspiracy theories, glossing over uncertainty and conflicting views, has that happened? Have you seen people being censored and shut down? I've seen it. I've seen newscasters saying the same thing on different channels, politicians saying the same thing in different countries. Fiona Fox here is saying that science necessarily involves discourse, experimentation, debate, varying voices. It's complicated. Even if you say that the governments of the United States and the governments of the UK did what they did with the best intentions at heart, to protect people, to preserve life. Part of what they did in order to do that was gloss over conflicting views. And I will say this, I've always thought this, that even your classic dictators, your Stalins, your Hitlers, what they think in their heads is, I know I'm right. If you knew what I know, you'd do what I'm telling you. I don't have time to explain all this to you, so we're going to make you do what I know is right. That's dictatorship. Now, admittedly, this is not Stalin, this is not Hitler, this is not those horrifying Chinese towers, but this is glossing over information. Which way is it going? Is it going the right direction? Which way is it heading? Is it heading towards utopia, freedom, liberty, democracy? The land grab for science communication has occasionally taken a more sinister turn in the form of proposals such as changes to the Civil Service Code, which would have prevented any government-funded scientist from speaking to the media without ministers' permission, or the anti-lobbying clause, which would have barred scientists in receipt of government money from petitioning for policy change. Wow, so if you've ever received government money, you can't argue with the government. That's censorship. That's state control. That's authoritarianism. I'm not arguing that it's as bad as China or our countries are as tyrannical as Russia. I'm not making such reductive or simplistic claims. But what I am saying is we are observing an increase of government authority in the realm of science, which is used to underwrite integrity and authority and, crucially, objectivity. That's what science is offering. You can't argue with this. This is just true. It's science. Well, it's science with a gun to its head. It's science, but you can't argue with us. It's science, but we can't have any contrary views. That's not science at all. Remember, a couple of days ago, we did a video that showed how evidence-based experimentation within universities is already being co-opted by the pharmaceutical industry. So you have the power of the pharmaceutical industry, you have the authority of the government, and yet you still have the claims of this is science, this is science. And what does that science ultimately do? It leads to authoritarianism. Don't question our measures because they're based on science. Well, we've seen where that can lead in extremis. I'm not saying we're there yet. I'm thanking God that we are not. And I'm praying that we never get there. But praying will not be enough. Action will be required. Awareness will be required. Specifically, literally, your awareness. Another area where we're seeing the exertion of control, where we're seeing the increase of authority, is in the social media sphere. I'm on social media of a form right now, and we're aware of censorship. We're aware that there are certain things that can be said and certain things that can't be said. How are you not banned from this channel? We stay awake and we play by the rules, and we do our best to communicate openly and honestly while recognizing the limitations that are inherent within our systems. Here, Caitlin Johnston, who's a fantastic journalist in my opinion, not perfect, but a fantastic journalist in my opinion, has written beautifully about social media censorship. Check this out. Twitter has been working in steadily increasing intimacy with the United States government since the US empire began pressuring Silicon Valley platforms to regulate content in support of established power structures following the 2016 election. Okay, so now we're seeing that social media and government are operating in tandem. You know this already. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. In 2020, Twitter was one of the many Silicon Valley corporations who coordinated directly with US government agencies to determine what content should be censored in order to secure the presidential election. We've done videos recently about how the Hunter Biden laptop story was suppressed. You know that already. You told us. We got into that story because of you guys. Now what we're hearing is that there was ongoing collaboration around censorship. In 2021, Twitter announced that it was orchestrating mass purges of foreign accounts on the advice of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI, which receives funding from many government institutions, including the US State Department. Twitter has also coordinated its mass purges of accounts with a cybersecurity firm called FireEye, which was founded in 2004 with money from the CIA's venture capital arm, In-Q-Tel. Firstly, why has the CIA got a venture capital arm? You know what we're going to need if we're going to spy on everyone? A venture capital arm? Yes, actually. And let's use that, FireEye, to purge people off of Twitter. Now, I'm not saying there aren't people on Twitter that, should be purged or might be purged or ought to be purged. But I'm also saying that FireEye, I don't even like the sound of that. If that cropped up as a baddie in a Batman film, I'd say they've gone too far. FireEye is displeased with this tweet. Who's paying for FireEye? You are, through your taxes. Oh, the irony. Don't point out irony, that displeases FireEye. Since the start of the war in Ukraine, Twitter has been aggressively boosting US narratives about the war by frequently showing users a Twitter topic without their having subscribed to it. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is bad. Russia, I guess, is probably a harder place to live than where I live in bucolic wonder, and perhaps where you live too. That doesn't mean that we exempt our nations from criticism, because apparently we can affect our countries through this thing called democracy, where what Russia does, that's happening over there, and whatever I write down on a bit of paper, it don't matter, and I can't see what's happening over there properly because no one will let me watch Russia today. So I like to focus on the country that I live in. When the invasion began, Twitter began placing warning labels on all Russia-backed media and delivering a pop-up message informing you that you are committing wrongthink if you try to share or even like a post linking to such outlets on the platform. Now, that ain't as bad as the wailing in the Chinese towers, but it is an attempt to exert control on communication and control information. I personally would like to be able to read what I want and decide for myself what's true, because I feel like I'm kind of clever enough to do that. Do you feel you're clever enough? Or would you like mummy and daddy to step in and pre-chew your information like a little baby bird and spit it into your mouth when all the hard work's been done? As more and more people find themselves branded with the Russia state-affiliated media label, Twitter has concurrently announced that it will be hiding the visibility of any account that wears it, announcing that the platform will not amplify or recommend government accounts belonging to states that limit access to free information and are engaged in armed interstate conflict. Which is a bit rich, considering the fact that the US does both of those things. That sort of is true. You know the statistics. You know that the United States has been bombing nations continually since the Second World War. All that stuff. You're aware of it. Like, I'm obviously not saying that what's happening to Ukrainian people is good. It's horrible, horrific, terrible thing. I pray that it ends as soon as possible. But it's not gonna change because Twitter won't let people openly communicate. That's nothing to do with that. What that's to do with is controlling you and making you more compliant, docile, dumb, and manageable. The audacity of a social media company which works hand in glove with the most powerful government on earth to go around branding people's state-affiliated media is appalling. Twitter is state-affiliated media. It is an instrument of imperial narrative control, just like all the other billionaire Silicon Valley megacorporations of immense influence. Caitlin Johnston there spelling it out. So bear in mind the image of those horrifying Chinese towers, the wailing, the lockdowns, the death of pets. Then consider what happens if the government controls science and determines which science should be amplified, which science should be ignored, which voices should be excluded in order that they can impose measures that they then say are based on science. Then what happens if we can't have open discourse on social media platforms? I am not trying to conflate the horror of what's happening in China right now with our increasing authoritarianism through the various means described in this video. What I am doing, let me be as plain as I can manage with you, is saying that we must really stay awake and stay aware, because the more power the state has, the more power big business has, the more power Silicon Valley has, the less power you and I will ultimately have. We should be fighting for our freedom. I don't mean through violence, I mean through non-compliance and the absolute insistence on actual democracy. The democracy you were promised in America that's written into your constitution. The democracy that's a proud tradition in this country and in France and all over Europe and will grow on the continent of Africa and in India. Wherever we are in the world, we have the same interest. We want to run our own lives. We want to be left alone. We don't want to be playthings and pawns in a game that we're not invited to play. We want to be free. We're not that different from one another. Our cultural, religious, ideological, racial, sexual differences must all be put aside in the pursuit of a shared dream. Individual, communal freedom, democracy for all, freedom and control of our own lives. But that's just what I think. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. How did you feel when you saw those towers? How do you feel about your pets? What do you think about Caitlin Johnston's article there about Twitter censorship? What do you think about the management and manipulation of scientific narratives to increase government control? Am I onto something? Are we heading in the wrong direction on this channel? All of this in the comments. Remember, subscribe. It really helps us if you subscribe. We're growing this channel. We're growing this community. If you want to come and see me live, there's a few tickets left in a few places and it's a spectacular show. There's a link in the description if you want to come. If you like this video, have a look at this one that I mentioned earlier or this one that I mentioned earlier. Click on this link if you want to be a member of our community so we can remain in direct communication. Lord alone knows that it's going to be important. More important though than any of these things. Please stay free.